King of Kent. Kent is a part of England, the extreme southeast part of England. And his time on earth is recorded at these dates. Oh, sorry. Those dates. So he's quite an early saint for Britain and a very early one for England, where they didn't have so much um, activity from Christian missionaries and so on at that time. I'm going to paste a link here, and I think if you click on this link, that you'll be able to see a very nice icon actually of him being baptized. Hopefully it works. Sorry if it doesn't work. It's a very nice Orthodox icon, an English one, that shows the time of his baptism. So there's not much to tell about his life because it was so long ago that we don't know a huge amount of details. But what we do know is really very interesting. So he, as I've said, he was King of Kent. And at this time, England had a number of different kingdoms, but Kent was probably the most important one. It was certainly the richest one. Kent has always been traditionally the richest part of England. Even today, we call it the Garden of England because it's very rich in producing agriculture and so on. So he was a very powerful man, and he was born into a world in England that was basically a pagan world, pagana. Some British people had been Christianized under the Roman Empire in its late stages in Britain. But after the Romans had left, most of those people returned again to paganism. And this is the world that he came into, and the kingdom he inherited was a pagan one. But something happened. He had a marriage to a lady called Bertha, and this lady was the daughter of the King of Paris. So probably it was a kind of arranged marriage between two royal houses. But anyway, he married this lady, and of course she was Christian, a very serious Christian. And she took with her from Paris a bishop to live with her and to be her spiritual guide in England, in Canterbury, where he lived, King Ethelbert. And it seems like he was well disposed, perhaps because of his love for her, or perhaps just because he was sympathetic to other religions or to Christianity. But he allowed this. He allowed her to have a bishop, and not only that, but he allowed her to build a church in Canterbury, a small church, which would serve really just her needs. But he helped his wife to construct this, and he permitted this despite himself being pagan. And then another interesting thing happened many years later. So they continued in this way. The queen was pagan, and he was pagan, and his wife, the queen, was Christian. And they continued in this way for many years. But then another thing happened, which is that over in Rome, the Pope in Rome, who was Saint Gregory the Great, in the end of the 6th century, around about the year Cinquecento Nozecishapte, decided he would send a mission to Britain because the Roman world had lost touch with England. They didn't even know if there were any Christians there or what they were doing. They didn't have any idea. So Pope Gregory decided he would send a monk on a mission, and this monk's name was Augustine. He was a very important monk. He was head of an important monastery in Rome, and he was allowed to select 40 other monks to take with him, and they all traveled. It took them a long time. They traveled to England, and eventually, about a year later, they arrived in England, and they were welcomed. Augustine and his 40 monks were welcomed into the King Ethelbert's court in Canterbury. And not only did he welcome them, he allowed them to preach, which was very important. Despite he being pagan and all of his subjects being pagan, he allowed them to preach. And in fact, he allowed them to have a monastery. And the monastery he allowed them to have was his own palace. He let them use his own palace as a monastery. This is before he became Christian. So we don't know if this was due to his great admiration for his wife or because of his growing personal interest in Christianity, but he did these extraordinary things. And then about a year after St. Augustine arrived on his mission, after a lot of probably discussions and persuasion and so on, he agreed to be converted, to be baptized Christian. And that's what's shown in the icon in the link which I gave you this moment. And this is a very important moment for English history, because he was the first king to be baptized Christian, to be converted to be Christian, the very, very first one. And it's also an important moment for England, because Augustine, the monk who baptized him, was of course Saint Augustine of Canterbury, the most famous saint, regarded as the father of all saints in England, and one which we commemorate regularly in our prayers in some of the church services. So he's regarded as probably the greatest saint in English history. And the church and the monastery which they were allowed to build in Canterbury is still there, and it's called Canterbury Cathedral, the famous Canterbury Cathedral. Of course, it's been changed a bit and so on. So this was a very important moment in English history. These two men, King Ethelbert, by becoming Christian and sending this signal to his subjects that, you know, this is something that they should consider, and of course St. Augustine arriving in England. And it had a great effect, because it's recorded by the historian Bede that within a few months, another 10,000 of his subjects, of the people he was king over, elected to be baptized also. 10,000, if you can imagine. So these monks and St. Augustine, I'm sure they were very busy doing these baptisms, although they probably baptized a lot of them at one, you know, on one day and so on. That was the situation, and was a very difficult moment for England, because King Ethelbert, or Saint Ethelbert as we know him now, he refused to have anybody forcibly converted. And in fact, some kings in Europe had done this. They'd forced people to become Christian, but he refused to do this, and he didn't force anyone, any of his subjects, to be converted. So he allowed time to take its course, and for people to slowly see the truth, the same truth that he had seen. He was a very patient man, just as he himself had taken many, many years to come to that moment of decision. He did the same. And it wasn't a definitive moment for England, because still there were a lot of ups and downs, with people returning to paganism and crossing back for many centuries. And in fact, his own son, who succeeded him when he died, King Ethelbert, was a pagan. He had refused to become Christian, despite his own father, you know, being converted. So the kingdom reverted back in a sense from the top to paganism. So a very interesting time. Hard for us to imagine now, you know, living at that time, how it must have been with these two kind of opposing religious ideas or forces in ordinary people's lives. You know, the Christianity would have felt like something new. You know, it would have been the new concept, the new idea, and for many people this would have been really, really difficult, and they needed a long time to slowly absorb the ideas of Christianity. I believe There was another king, a neighboring king, who also was persuaded by St. Augustine and St. Ethelbert to become to be converted as well. And his sons also refused. And when they became kings, they also were pagan kings. So very hard time for those who were trying to advance the word of God in England, and a lot of ups and downs. But Saint Ethelbert certainly did something extraordinary. He kind of broke the mold at the time and stepped away from paganism definitively, and um, was a turning point of sorts anyway in English history, and an interesting personal story because of his involvement with Augustine personally, and allowing him to create what became the cathedral at Canterbury Cathedral, which is probably the most famous and beautiful one in Britain. And that's it. So just a bit of English history, really, not